When winter swept across the battlefields of World War II, many soldiers discovered that frostbite and cold claimed more lives than bullets. Hypothermia wasn't dramatic. It crept in silently through damp clothes, frozen boots, and sleepless nights in open trenches. By 1943, military doctors realized that standard wool blankets weren't enough. The field gear issued to soldiers was often thin, soaked or frozen stiff by dawn. Yet, among the chaos, a handful of field medics and frontline troops discovered an ingenious trick, one that used the same old blanket everyone had, but in a way that completely changed its performance. It became known among veterans as the field blanket wrap, a forgotten technique that outsmarted hypothermia without new gear or extra rations. This wasn't just another military procedure. It was born from necessity and refined by experience in the worst conditions imaginable. When soldiers couldn't count on new supplies or dry barracks, they had to improvise. The secret wasn't in the blanket itself, but in how it was used, and how it combined heat, moisture control, and insulation from the ground to trap body warmth for hours. Modern survivalists still overlook this trick, but it remains one of the simplest, most effective methods of preventing heat loss in the field. The secret wasn't in the blanket. It was in the layering method. The standard wool field blanket was a military staple from World War I through the Korean War. It was thick, durable and naturally water-resistant to a point, but on its own it couldn't stand up to prolonged exposure. Soldiers discovered that the trick was to stop treating the blanket as an outer cover and start using it as a core layer within a system. The real key came from combining the blanket with materials like oiled canvas wax cloth or even newspaper. Here's how the method worked. Soldiers would first lay a barrier between themselves and the ground, using their rain poncho, oilcloth, or any waterproof sheet. This kept ground moisture from soaking up through the blanket. Next came the wool blanket, wrapped tightly around the torso with the edges tucked to trap warm air. Then came the genius step. They layered a second moisture-resistant material over the blanket. It could be a ground sheet, a wax jacket, or even layers of paper or ash-coated fabric. The result was a crude but effective vapor barrier system. The wool held heat, while the outer layer trapped the escaping moisture vapor and reflected radiant heat back toward the body. This wasn't theory. It worked. Field reports from the Ardennes and Eastern Front describe soldiers surviving nights in sub-zero conditions by combining their blanket with a poncho or canvas tarp. The difference between life and death came down to how the blanket was wrapped and sealed. Those who slept directly on frozen soil often froze within hours. Those who used this layered system could stay alive until sunrise. By 1944, Army medics began formally using the same idea to revive half-frozen troops. They learned that wrapping a soldier in a dry blanket wasn't enough. The body's remaining heat escaped too quickly. Instead, they used a double barrier technique. The patient was laid on top of an oilcloth or rubber sheet, wrapped tightly in a wool blanket, and then encased again in the same waterproof sheet. It created a controlled microclimate, slowly restoring core temperature without shocking the system. This simple approach was so effective that versions of it later appeared in mountain rescue manuals and Cold War survival guides. Even modern bivvy sacks and emergency foil blankets are based on the same principle: trap air, block moisture, and reflect heat inward. The wartime version was cruder, but no less efficient. The wool provided breathable warmth. The waterproof outer layer sealed it in, and the insulating base stopped the cold earth from draining body heat. For today's survivalists and preppers, this old method is still practical and reliable, especially when commercial gear fails or isn't available. The modern version uses 3 essential layers: a ground barrier, an insulating layer, and a moisture shield. Start with something waterproof on the bottom, anything from a plastic tarp to a waxed cloth. Next, wrap a wool or fleece blanket tightly around the torso, tucking in corners to prevent drafts. Finally, add a thin outer layer to trap the warmth. A poncho, rain jacket, or even garbage bag works in emergencies. If the ground is frozen, add dry leaves, grass, or cardboard beneath the bottom layer for extra insulation. The goal is to create trapped pockets of air while keeping everything sealed from wind and water. Soldiers often used ashes or dry soil to fill gaps around the edges of their bedding to prevent drafts, a primitive but highly effective method of maintaining warmth through the night. The reason this system works so well comes down to physics. Heat loss occurs in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and evaporation. A blanket alone only slows conduction, heat escaping by direct contact. But the field blanket trick addressed all 3. The ground barrier stopped conduction, the wool trapped heat and air, and the outer waterproof layer stopped evaporation and convection. In short, it turned a single blanket into a survival system that could rival modern sleeping bags. Even the British and American militaries later adapted parts of this design into their gear. The US M1943 field jacket included a detachable liner and outer shell built on the same concept: trap heat, seal out moisture, and maintain breathability. In Arctic training manuals of the 1950s, soldiers were still being taught the field blanket technique, proof of its enduring value. Today, the concept survives in modern survival bivvies, reflective blankets, and layer-based sleeping systems. Yet the principle remains unchanged from what soldiers learned in the mud and snow of wartime Europe. The combination of wool, a waterproof barrier, and proper sealing still outperforms many expensive modern materials in pure survival terms. The lesson from this forgotten trick is simple. Survival doesn't come from gear alone. It comes from knowledge. The same principles that saved soldiers in 1943 can save anyone facing cold exposure today. Whether camping, prepping, or working in the field, knowing how to trap warmth with the materials on hand is what separates comfort from crisis. If you value historical survival knowledge that still applies to real-world situations, make sure to subscribe to Backyard Wisdom. Every week, we dig into lost wartime methods and forgotten fieldcraft that still work when modern gear fails. Share this video with someone who loves history as much as practicality, because sometimes the old ways were the smartest of all.